Crazy Bus is a scary story about a boy who takes a ride on a strange bus and gets the fright of his life. For years, my parents had told me about the crazy bus crash that happened near our house years ago. One morning, just days before I was born, my mother had been out in the garden, plucking weeds, when she heard a horrible noise. It was a series of high-pitched screams, then a screeching of tires, followed by a tremendous crash. All of the people in the area rushed out of their houses to see what was going on. Down at the bottom of the old coach road, they found black tire marks leading to a nearby cliff. When they rushed to the cliff edge, they saw the wreckage of a bus down below. It had apparently driven straight off the cliff and crashed on the jagged rocks at the bottom. The people ran down to where the smoking wreckage was lying strewn about, in an effort to help the survivors. They were horrified when they discovered that it was the local school bus and all of the passengers on board were their own children. The bodies of the dead kids lay tangled in the twisted metal. Some had been thrown out of the bus as it fell and their bodies had smashed against the rocks, killing them on impact. Others had been decapitated by flying glass and shards of metal inside the bus. The parents were screaming and crying as they found the mangled remains of their sons and daughters in the charred wreckage. When the ambulance and fire department arrived, they found no survivors. Every single child on the bus had been killed in the crash. It was the most horrific disaster the area had ever experienced. In one horrible moment, an entire generation had been wiped out. The parents of the dead children were inconsolable. A few days later, a huge funeral was held for all of the kids who had perished. People came from miles around to pay their respects and share in the grief. Almost every family in the area had lost a child in the accident. Some had even lost 2 or 3. Almost 40 small coffins were lowered into the ground that day. An inquest was held shortly afterwards, and police got to the bottom of what had happened and finally determined who was to blame for causing the terrible crash. It seems that a mental patient from the local insane asylum had escaped the night before. He had broken into the bus station and stolen a driver's uniform. That night, he lay in wait until the doors of the bus station were unlocked. Then, he crept aboard the school bus and drove out through the gates without alerting anyone. That morning, he drove the school bus around the countryside, picking up all the unsuspecting kids who were waiting by the roadside, on their way to school. He was dressed in a bus driver's uniform, so nobody suspected a thing. Once he had collected every kid on the route, the mental patient floored the accelerator and drove at high speed off the cliff. The people in our area never forgot the terrible accident that escaped mental patient caused. When I was growing up, there were not very many other children to play with. Most had been killed in the crazy bus crash. The only kids that survived were those who had been too young to attend school at the time. The story I am about to tell happened when I was 13 years old. My parents allowed me to go to the movies at the theater in town. I met a bunch of friends there and we had a great time watching the movie. Afterwards, we lost track of time and it was very late by the time we decided to go home. I must have been waiting at the bus stop for half an hour before I realized that I had missed the last bus. Cursing myself for being so careless, I wondered how I would manage to get home. It wasn't all that far to walk, perhaps a mile or 2. But the roads were treacherous at night because, in our area, there were no street lamps to light the way. A lot of people had been hit by cars as they walked in the darkness. I found a payphone and called home. My mom answered and I told her I'd missed the last bus home. She began to panic, telling me that my father was out and had taken the car with him. She wouldn't be able to pick me up. I told her I'd just walk home, but she begged me not to, saying that the roads were much too dangerous at that time of night. Even worse, it was beginning to snow, which meant that even if a car did manage to see me in the dark, it probably wouldn't have time to brake before it hit me. She said she would try to contact our neighbors and see if they would be able to drive into town to pick me up. After I hung up the phone, I began to get impatient. Eventually, I decided that the only thing I could do was walk home by myself, so I set off and hoped for the best. I was walking along the lonely country road in complete darkness, trying not to trip over a pothole or fall into a ditch, when I saw headlights coming up over the hill behind me. Whether it was a car or a bus, it was coming up very fast, and quite noiselessly through the snow-covered road. As it drew nearer, I could make out the outlines of the vehicle. It appeared to be a bus, and my only hope was that the driver would be able to see me in the dark and stop for me. It came round the bend of the road, and bathed me in bright white light. The headlights blazed through the darkness like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped to the side of the road and waved my hand, but the bus passed me at full speed, and for a moment I feared that I had missed it. But then I heard the screech of brakes and the bus stopped dead a short distance ahead of me. I ran as fast as I could and came up to it just as the door swung open. As soon as I stepped in, the door shut behind me and the driver took off again at full speed. The bus was dark inside, but as my eyes began to adjust, I could see that it was almost full, despite the fact that it was late at night. I found a vacant seat and sat down, resting my weary legs. The atmosphere of the coach seemed cold. Colder, if possible, than outside, and there was a strange and disagreeable smell. I looked round at the other passengers. They were all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each of them stared straight ahead. The deathly quiet was unsettling, and the smell was quickly becoming unbearable. I felt much too ill to say anything at all. The icy coldness inside the bus chilled me to the bone, and the strange smell was making me sick. Shivering from head to foot, I turned to the young boy beside me and asked if I could open the window. He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. I repeated the question more loudly, but still got no answer. When I could no longer stand the stench, I reached across and tried to open the window myself, but the latch broke off in my hand. It was then that I realized the window was covered in cobwebs and mildew. In fact, every part of the bus seemed to be in a terrible state of disrepair. Almost decay. The leather seats were crusted with mold, and the floor was literally rotting and breaking away beneath my feet. I turned to the boy beside me again and asked, "What is wrong with this bus?" Without saying a word, he turned his head slowly and looked me in the face. I will never forget that look as long as I live. My heart turned cold and all the blood drained from my face. His eyes were wide and seemed as if they were popping out of his head. His face was as pale and leathery as a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back, showing big yellow teeth. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a dreadful feeling of horror came over me. I became aware that everyone on the bus was staring straight at me with the same ghastly look on their faces. Their awful faces were covered in rotting flesh and their clothes were covered in dirt. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all staring menacingly at me. A shriek of terror burst from my lips as I ran down the aisle, threw myself against the door, and tried to open it. In that single instant, as the bus door swung open, I heard a mighty crash and the bus rocked to and fro like a ship in a storm at sea. Then, I heard many voices, children's voices, all screaming in unison, and I felt a crushing pain before everything went black. It seemed as if I had been unconscious for days when I woke up and found my mom was by my bedside. She told me I had fallen over a cliff near the old coach road. The only reason I hadn't been killed was that I had landed on a deep snowdrift that had accumulated on the rocks beneath. I was discovered at daybreak by a local farmer, who carried me to the nearest hospital. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with 2 broken legs, a broken arm and a deep cut on my forehead. The place where I fell, my mom told me, was the same exact spot where the horrible school bus accident had happened 13 years before. Now, you can believe what you want. Some people may call me a liar and others may say I'm just crazy, but I know that 13 years ago, days before I was born, I was a passenger in that crazy bus crash.
Just outside of the town I live in, there is a massive densely wooded park that is largely forgotten. It's not that people don't know it is there, but it's simply more of an afterthought. It's not ideal for hiking, it doesn't have any kid-friendly play areas, or even a pond to attempt fishing in. What it essentially amounts to is miles and miles of wooded area. But me and my college buddy Derek had long known about something that lay deep within the park, and we had finally built up the courage and resources to explore it. Derek had always been into this type of thing since I met him a few years before at the start of college. Although we didn't know each other for that long, we quickly became best friends, forming a connection like I'd never had with anyone before. Despite that, he was the type of person who would keep a lot of stuff buried deep. I never blamed him for it, as his usual coping mechanisms tended to be positive, such as going to the gym or writing. But when his sister had passed away a few months prior, I didn't hear from him for a week. One day he finally returned my calls, and he had only one thing to say. Henderson Park, this summer. We are going to find it. At the beginning of the summer break, we began our hike. After a couple hours of trekking a route which we had planned and charted out for months, we finally made it to the spot. It was a clearing spanning a couple hundred meters in area, and once we made it past the last of the foliage, it didn't take but a second to identify what we had come for. In the middle of this open patch lay a large building, abandoned to time and worn down by nature. But yet it stood, beckoning us to enter. The abandoned structure of Henderson Park had been a legend in this town since I could remember. No one knows how it got there, or what it used to be. It was simply a massive building miles deep into the wilderness, with no documentation or history. I almost didn't believe it was real, but we had found someone previously who had made a detailed map of the park. We decided if the structure was there, we were going to find it. There it is, Sam. Glad to see we didn't come all this way for nothing, Derek said as we rested for a moment to catch our breath. You act as if we hadn't done our research, I responded, secretly as relieved as he was. There was always the possibility after all that the building had withered away, or that a small mistake in navigation would send us off the path. But, luckily, we had found our destination with relative ease. We took the moment to look up at it while we gathered our bearings, and documented it with some pictures. It stood tall with at least 3 floors, and had plenty of surface area. It appeared like it had been an old school or hospital of some sort based on its layout. Its exterior was a dark gray, tainted by the decay and moss creeping around it. Despite the wear and tear, there was a surprising lack of graffiti or any signs of human tampering. Well, you ready to see what's in there? I said, breaking the silence. Derek turned to me, a look of worry appearing on his face. No, I think we should head back. He then flashed me a big grin, and began to make his way to the structure. I followed, trying to ignore his stupid joke. We made our way to the entrance doors, and noted that they appeared to be missing, the only remaining evidence being some scattered pieces of glass. I noted at this point that besides the obvious weathering over time, this building did not seem old at all. In fact, it was as if a building from the modern day had been left to the whims of nature for a century. Before I could ponder this in too much detail, we continued inward, and quickly the darkness began to consume our vision. Derek turned on his flashlight, illuminating the hallway directly in front of us. It was lined with abandoned lockers and debris, which covered most of the doorways. Most of the paths on this floor appeared to be blocked off, or just seemed a bit unstable due to damaged pillars and missing walls. We explored what little we could safely access, until finally coming upon a set of stairs that could either have taken us up to the second floor, or downwards towards what I assumed was a basement area. We wanted to start somewhere, and work our way through the building seamlessly. That inevitably left us with a decision: should we go upstairs, or explore the basement first? Finally, Derek spoke up. Dude, I think we should split up. You can't be serious. How are we going to explore both at the same time? It's the only way, he insisted. Derek. I'm kidding, man. Let's start downstairs and we can work our way up, Derek said, descending the stairs before I could respond. The stairs proved to be much deeper than we thought. What I assumed was going to take us 1 floor down felt more like 100. After walking down the stairs for what felt like 10 minutes, I spoke up. Hey man, this is kind of ridiculous. How deep does this staircase go? I don't know, Sam. It's kind of freaking me out, to be honest, but... I nodded in agreement. Derek did seem to be getting genuinely concerned for the first time during this trip, but we were on the same page. We had to keep going at this point. Whether this staircase was bottomless, or a descent into hell itself, we were going to see the end of it. Luckily, it turned out to be neither of those things, because a few minutes later we hit the bottom. Well, good news is if one of us gets hurt, the other only needs to drag them up 70 flights of stairs, Derek joked, although the thought only made me uneasy. The area we found ourselves in would probably be best compared to that of a subway tunnel. Well, without the actual train tracks. What lay before us was simply a long vacant tunnel with concrete walls and flooring, and no end in sight. I was beginning to feel like we were out of our depth here. However, I didn't think to protest as Derek began walking down into the tunnel. At least not until we began to hear something echoing deep within the tunnel. We immediately stopped dead in our tracks. What sounded like a high-pitched synth had begun ringing through the tunnel. The echoing was making me feel queasy as it reverberated through my body. It paused for a movement before resuming, every few seconds another tone ringing out like a beacon, progressively getting louder, and presumably closer. The sound started to become ear-piercing, and before I knew it I was on my knees holding my ears, barely withstanding the sharp ringing throughout my head. Just as I thought I was going to black out from the sheer intensity of it, the sound stopped in an instant. I looked over to Derek, who was also recovering from the auditory assault. We both shared a glance and a nod. Our curiosity had seemingly run its course, and we started to quickly head back from the way we came. I was unsure of how to rationalize what just happened, but all I knew is that I would prefer not to experience whatever that was any closer. That's when we heard something else from within the tunnel. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Our speed walk quickly escalated into a jog, and then a run. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but I had some serious doubts that many other people were exploring this place, and especially wandering through this forsaken tunnel. And so we ran, and ran. We hadn't been walking down the tunnel for more than a minute. There was no way we were that far away from the stairs. Yet again, it felt like we were in an endless loop with no end in sight. But then we found it. We stopped, and looked at the staircase as we caught our breath. So, Derek began, trying to form his thoughts. I walked up to the foot of the stairs and put my hands on the large chunks of rubble that now blocked our only exit off. I didn't even have the energy to freak out, or to scream. I slumped down, staring at the rubble as if my gaze alone could alter the grim reality we were faced with. That sound, it had to have caused something to collapse, Derek said, trying to rationalize the situation as if that would make things any better. Derek, we are going to die down here, I said weakly. Before he could respond, we remembered why we were running. The footsteps were now within 20 feet of us, and we had nowhere to run. We both turned our gaze to the direction they were coming from. Whatever it was seemed to be hidden in the shadows, and neither of us wanted to see what was approaching. I could just barely make the outline of a shambling figure, moving erratically, and twitching violently with each step. We nodded to each other, seemingly on the same page that if we die here, we are gonna at least put up a fight. But after taking a deep breath, Derek lifted his flashlight and pointed it towards the figure. Derek was lost for words, as was I. There stood Emily, Derek's sister. She appeared to be bruised and beaten, covered in scratches and wearing tattered clothing. But Emily had died earlier that year. This didn't make any sense why she would be alive, let alone here. Emily. I thought you were. Derek struggled to find words, as his tears began to well up. Emily weakly smiled, clearly having been through hell. But something was wrong. She had stopped moving. She looked like she could barely stand. Her head was lowered, as if she couldn't lift it. I tried to look into her eyes. Derek, she said weakly. Derek began to walk towards her, his arms open wide ready to embrace her. It all played out in slow motion, as he neared her. I didn't have time to warn him. I didn't have time to tell him to stop, as I noticed the hollow blackness of what should be her eyes. The hellish grin that she could hardly contain. She grabbed him and met his gaze. I can't get the image out of my head, of the look of terror on my best friend's face as he looked into the abyss that were that creature's eyes. And then, she unhinged her jaw beyond the point of reason, latching onto Derek as he began to scream. But he didn't have the chance to make a sound as the creature closed its jaws over his head. I ran. Without thinking, I left my friend to his fate, knowing full well he was already dead. I ran. And I kept running. I don't know what I was thinking, or where I was running to. The synth began to reverberate throughout the tunnel, and the ear-splitting ringing began to return, escalating until my body was numb and I couldn't sense where I was. I suddenly snapped back into consciousness, my head still ringing. I lay at the entrance of the structure. It was still bright outside. I sat up, trying to regain my senses. I had no idea what happened. I don't know if I blacked out, and somehow found an exit, but that didn't seem likely. I still had my bag with me, with water and food. I could make it back by night if I started hiking. And that's what I did. I reported Derek missing and explained that we got split up on the hike. It's not an uncommon thing for people to go missing on long treks through parks of this size, so it seemed reasonable. I haven't mentioned the structure to anyone until now. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. What if Derek somehow survived? I feel like he is calling to me. I feel like I need to help him. I know I shouldn't, but something is telling me to go back to the structure.